Hello and welcome to the Old Garage number 51. I'm Wild Bill and I've got some questions, some answers. We've got some silliness, cool shout out, so let's get things rolling. First question came from the last at the Old Garage. This is from 4TC_Mitz and says that during the time your channel covers, J.C. Whitney and Company was founded in Chicago. In the early 1970s, the catalog contained a plethora of parts for the Ford Model T. It was said at the time, you could build a new Model T with just the parts from J.C. Whitney. Thinking about assembly required, was it actually possible? Did anyone ever try to do it? It probably would have been more expensive to do that than to just buy a used one. That's a good point. Well, as far as J.C. Whitney's concerned, I am going to get to them. They didn't actually start their catalog side of the business until after World War I. Prior to that, they were, well, a recycling company. Essentially, they would buy cars at scrap value, strip them of anything, any parts that were resellable, and then take what was left over and sell it for scrap. And the catalog business grew from there. But as far as you get pre-World War I, doing that, buying a car from, off the shelf or out of a catalog or magazine, absolutely it was done. This was very common. You have all over the world, there were magazines and periodicals about auto enthusiasts, for auto enthusiasts, all over the place, in England and France, America, Germany, Australia, everywhere. I know in the U.S., a very popular one was the Cycle and Auto Trade Journal. And you could go into these magazines and buy a car directly from them, but also you could buy components. There would be advertisements in them for the various companies that would provide engines and transmissions and brakes and wheels and chassis and all sorts of things. And you could, just by going to the various, trade journals and periodicals that were about cars, buy parts and assemble cars. And in fact, there's a lot of companies that existed back then that did exactly that. And there's a whole term for it. It's called the assembled car, where they would buy the engines from this company, then they would buy the transmission from this company, they would buy the electrics from this company, they would buy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Put them all together and then put their own badge on it. This was often done. Then you have, if you're an individual and you want to buy a car on your own, you're right, even back then that would be more expensive because the people that were mostly buying or assembling cars in the way you're suggesting were doing it in bulk as a business. But if you just wanted to buy a one-off, back then, a little harder to do because, if you went to the trade manuals and said, yeah, I want to buy one engine, they'd say, why? We sell them in lots of 100. Or they would sell you one engine, but now you're going to pay full retail for it. And the same is true with the transmissions and the chassis and everything else. So, yeah, it was very commonly done. By manufacturers. Individuals did it sometimes. It was usually easier for an individual to just find a chassis or an engine somewhere and then just kind of build around it rather than buy every single part of the car. But you could, and it was done. It's just at an individual level, it was far less often back then. Okay. Next question, I had a couple questions from the episode on Hotchkiss. First one is from James MacArthur. And he's asked, at the 4-minute mark, you have a shot of the Hotchkiss engine. It looks like it was painted red. Yes, it was. Was it a thing to paint engines back then? I know today very few of them are painted, usually red or blinged out in chrome. Was there a desire amongst the public to have a painted or chromed engine? It wasn't really necessarily the public. It was more the manufacturers that were doing it, and a number of reasons, primarily to protect the engine. Unlike, modern cars, where there is a bit of protection from the weather for the engine itself, you didn't have that, much of that back in the day. And you didn't want your engine to get rusty. or to start to otherwise get corrosion from leaking fluids, be it gas, oil, whatever. And so painting the engines was very common. And some companies would pick specific colors that they would use. Another thing that was also done on your more higher end cars was to polish the block, the engine block, or you sometimes even machine turn it like Bugatti, where rather than having any paint, the surface of the engine block was left bare and then treated, usually anodized or something like that, so that it would again help prevent corrosion. Now, they didn't typically use chrome back then underneath the hood. That didn't start getting popular until the late 1920s. Prior to that, it was usually going to be copper, brass, or nickel that would be used for various piping and hoses and such. But the engine block itself, most of the time they were painted. Often it was just black, just because you didn't want to make a spectacle of it. But then again, some people did, because you get back pre-World War I, these engines, I mean, these are modern models of technology. They're incredible. Wow, marvelous. And so putting bling on it, or to dress it up or make it look pretty, was actually intentionally done by the manufacturer. It was just to show off the technology and just how cool this engine looks. And so you would have them painted in different colors, and then you'd have, the fuel lines would be brass, and then these lines would be copper, and this one would be, would be nickel, and that was done a lot. So yeah, absolutely, it was very commonly done. Okay, and the next question I have came from Jeff Barrett, also from Hotchkiss, and he asked, are the straps there to hold the roof down or the fender up? Okay, well, here's the picture. And, well, it is absolutely to keep the top down. You look at those fenders and the fenders on those cars, I mean, occasionally you had companies that would make a fender that was basically a framework with canvas or leather, spanning the space. But most of the time that was thick steel mounted very stoutly. That fender's not going anywhere. You could probably jack up the car with by the fenders. I wouldn't do it, but definitely to keep the top down. But it's interesting as to why they would use straps. And there's two situations where you will see straps on a vintage car in this manner. The first is if the car has no windshield, because the obvious thing to do would be to take your top and then latch it to the windshield frame. But if there's no windshield, there's no windshield frame, and therefore there's nothing to latch it to. And so you're going to tie it, the top down to either the fenders, or sometimes there'd be another loop, in the well between the fender or the hood cowl, or sometimes it's on the hood cowl. But either way, some place to strap it down so that if you're going against the wind and you're at speed, you don't want the top to blow open and possibly get damaged. That was, one situation, no windshield. The second situation was when it had a windshield, but that windshield did not have a permanently fixed frame. This was common with windshields that were foldable, where you could lay the thing down over the hood, over the cowl, or you could have a split windshield where the bottom is stable and the top moves, or sometimes both of them do, and you can scissor the thing. But either way, even though that windshield may have a frame, that frame's not always going to be in the same position, and so therefore it's if the windshield is going to be down while you're driving, and you want the top closed, well, you got nothing to latch it to again, so you need the straps. So that's why it was done, and they pretty much disappeared by the mid-1920s as the whole foldable windshields and the split cowl or split windshields thing that faded out. But that's what they were for. Okay, and those were the questions. So let's go ahead and we're going to do some silliness here. And what we're going to talk about today for silly is it's another 5 list. And in this case, it's things there are a lot of things that we do while driving in the modern world today in our cars that you just wouldn't do or would be difficult to do rather in a pre-World War I car. And so here's my top 5 things that we do while driving, and yet it's not going to happen in a vintage car. And number 5 is going to be put on makeup. Now, I've never done this myself, but for those ladies out there that drive putting on makeup, try driving a car that takes 2 hands and 3 feet to operate, and you're not going to have the opportunity to put on makeup. You also don't have a rear view mirror. Many of them didn't even have the whole idea of a sun visor. Didn't even happen until the very late 19-teens. And even those were, and they were rare even then. So you don't have you don't have a mirror. The car's bouncy, the suspension's not all that great. So yeah, putting on makeup, not going to work. At number 4, sleep. Now, I don't mean sleeping while you're driving. I mean, stopping at a rest area or something like that. I've done it, long drive, pull over. I just need to take a cat nap, lean the seat back and just grab a couple of Z's and then get a little refresh going on the road. Well, those old cars, they didn't necessarily have seats you could recline. And so, they're meant to only sit. And so they're not particularly comfortable to sleep in. Great for driving, but not for sleeping. Once you get into the 1920s and you start getting more of the bench seat types, where you can kind of, get in the back and kind of stretch yourself, then you could sleep in them. But pre-World War I, not going to be easy. Okay, which leads us to number 3, which is eat and drive. I do it all the time, okay? I can't tell you how many of the sandwiches my wife makes me for lunch I'm eating while I'm going down the highway. And again, it's the same issue with putting on makeup. The car itself, it takes a lot more attention to drive. You've got to handle things a lot, and be moving knobs and levers and pedals and such so much that it makes activities outside of driving the car difficult to do. So eating, yeah, not an easy thing to do. At number 2, I'm combining these two together, and that is speeding or tailgating. Now, in a car built before World War I, it's unless you're in a school zone, it's going to be difficult to get a speeding ticket. And it's also going to be difficult to tailgate somebody unless they're doing it intentionally, letting you tailgate them because they're like filming you or something. So, because you just don't have the speed and the acceleration to do it. You can't rage drive a vintage car. It just doesn't work that way. You're going to take your time whether you like it or not. So that's my number 2. But here's my number 1 thing that is, going to be difficult to do in a pre-World War I car, and that is hit a deer. Now think with me for a minute here, okay? In most situations, not all, most situations, these cars are, that are pre-World War I, have special registrations. And so they can only be used, on certain days at certain times or certain events. Okay? So like in parades or in festivals or situations like that where there's going to be people all over the place watching it, there's not going to be any deer around. You can drive these things. I know at least in where I live, if you have a horseless carriage registered car, really Sundays is the day you can drive it and not at night. And you're not going to be going that fast. And of course the car is, a lot noisier than anything that you have today. And so, even if if a deer came out in front of you, you're not going fast enough to damage the deer, okay? And the deer probably will get out of your way, and you'll be going ooga ooga honk honk, and trying to use what little braking you have, But we're talking about pre-World War I cars. You're probably not going to drive them any more than 20, 25, maybe 30 miles an hour, unless it's a special event, and in which case you're going to be doing it on a track, or on a rally course or something like that. So that's my number 1 for those reasons. It's hit a deer. It's just not going to. You wouldn't worry about it. Okay, so there's the silliness. Now we do have a shout out, and today's this is a neat channel. This is a curious history. Now this guy John, what he does on his channel, and I seriously dig it. He does biographies, sometimes he does a specific events in history, sometimes rather obscure events in history, and goes into some detail about them. And he's all over the world with them, and they're really cool. I mean, the way he presents them, the way he writes them up, it's a great channel. You know, Curious History, link in the description downstairs, down below, downstairs. But anyway, that's what we have today for the old garage, and we will see you next time. Peace.